The acrid smell of gunpowder drifted across the calm waters of Lake Erie as the first British cannonball whistled through the morning air, falling short of its intended target. It was September 10, 1813, and 28-year-old Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry stood on the deck of his flagship, the USS Lawrence, watching the enemy fleet approach with a mixture of determination and calculated dread. The British squadron, commanded by Captain Robert Heriot Barclay, had emerged from the mist like ghostly harbingers of war, 6 vessels strong, led by the formidable HMS Detroit with its 19 guns. They moved with the confidence of a navy that had ruled the seas for decades. Against them, Perry commanded 9 American vessels, a hastily assembled fleet built in the wilderness shipyards of Presque Isle, Pennsylvania. From green timber and determination, Perry's jaw tightened as he surveyed the battlefield. The British had chosen their position well, forming a line that would allow their long guns to devastate the American fleet. Before Perry could close to effective range with his carronades, the Detroit began the deadly dance of naval warfare, its long guns booming across the water at approximately 1.5 miles distance. The first shot fell harmlessly into the lake, but Perry knew the British gunners were merely finding their range. "Signal the fleet to close and engage," Perry commanded, his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart. He had spent months preparing for this moment, knowing that control of Lake Erie would determine the fate of the entire northwestern frontier. The British held Fort Detroit and had allied themselves with Tecumseh's Confederacy of Indian tribes. If they maintained control of the lake, they could continue to supply their forces and launch devastating raids into American territory. The USS Lawrence, named after the fallen naval hero Captain James Lawrence, began its approach toward the British line. Perry's strategy was audacious in its simplicity: close the distance quickly to negate the British advantage in long-range artillery, then unleash the devastating power of his carronades at close quarters. It was a plan that required courage, precise timing, and no small measure of luck. As the American flagship advanced, the British guns found their mark. The Detroit's 18-pound long guns sent shot after shot crashing into the Lawrence's hull. Splitters of wood flew like deadly missiles across the deck, and Perry watched grimly as his men began to fall. The British had concentrated their fire on his flagship, recognizing that breaking American morale meant breaking Perry himself. Behind the Lawrence, the rest of the American fleet followed in line. The USS Niagara, commanded by Captain Jesse Duncan Elliott, maintained her position but seemed hesitant to close with the enemy. The smaller vessels, the Caledonia, Ariel, Scorpion, Somers, Porcupine, Tigress, and Trip, pressed forward with varying degrees of enthusiasm and effectiveness. The battle had begun in earnest now, with the roar of cannons echoing across the lake like rolling thunder. Perry stood firm on his quarterdeck, his blue uniform coat already stained with powder smoke and the blood of wounded men. Every fiber of his being was focused on the moment when he could bring his carronades to bear on the enemy line. According to detailed accounts preserved in the National Archives, Perry's initial plan was to close rapidly and engage the British at close quarters, where American firepower would prove decisive. The British, however, had anticipated this tactic and positioned themselves to maximize the effectiveness of their long guns during the approach. The opening phase of the battle would test not only Perry's tactical skills, but also the courage of every man in his squadron. The USS Lawrence shuddered under the relentless British bombardment as Perry's flagship bore the brunt of the enemy's concentrated fire. By 12:30 in the afternoon, the situation had become desperate. The British had focused their attention on the American flagship, recognizing that destroying Perry's command would likely break the morale of the entire American fleet. Captain Robert Heriot Barclay, commanding the British squadron from the HMS Detroit, had positioned his ships to create a deadly gauntlet that the Americans would have to run. The Detroit, Queen Charlotte, Lady Prevost, Hunter, Little Belt, and Chippewa formed a formidable line, their guns trained on the approaching American vessels. Barclay, a veteran of Trafalgar who had lost an arm in previous naval service, understood the importance of this engagement as well as Perry did. The Lawrence's deck had become a scene of controlled chaos. Cannonballs crashed through the ship's wooden sides, sending deadly splinters flying in all directions. Perry's crew, many of them inexperienced volunteers and militiamen, worked their guns with desperate efficiency. The ship's surgeon, Dr. Usher Parsons, had established his makeshift hospital in the ship's hold, where the wounded were carried in an endless stream. "Keep those guns firing," Perry shouted over the deafening roar of battle. His voice carried across the smoke-filled deck, inspiring his men to continue loading and firing despite the carnage around them. The Lawrence's carronades, when they could be brought to bear, delivered devastating blows to the British vessels. These short-range guns, nicknamed smashers by the sailors, could punch through wooden hulls at close range like a giant's fist. As the afternoon wore on, the Lawrence's situation became increasingly precarious. The ship's masts had been shot away, her rigging hung in tatters, and her hull was riddled with holes. Of the Lawrence's crew of 103 men, only Perry and a handful of others remained uninjured. The ship's decks were slick with blood, and the air was thick with the groans of wounded men and the acrid smoke of gunpowder. Perry realized that his flagship was becoming a liability rather than an asset. The Lawrence was so badly damaged that she could no longer maneuver effectively, and her guns were being systematically silenced by British fire. Yet throughout this ordeal, Perry noticed something that would prove crucial to his ultimate strategy. The USS Niagara, commanded by Captain Jesse Duncan Elliott, remained relatively undamaged, but was not fully engaged in the battle. The Niagara had maintained her position in the American line, but had not closed with the enemy as aggressively as Perry had hoped. Whether this was due to tactical caution, communication problems, or some other factor, the result was that the Niagara retained most of her fighting capacity, while the Lawrence was being systematically destroyed. It was at this critical moment that Perry made the decision that would define not only the battle, but his entire career. Rather than surrender his battered flagship or continue to fight a losing battle from a disabled vessel, he would transfer his command to the Niagara and personally lead a renewed assault on the British line. This decision required not only extraordinary courage, but also precise timing and flawless execution. As the British continued their bombardment, Perry prepared for one of the most daring maneuvers in naval history. He would have to cross the water between the two American vessels under enemy fire, carrying with him the battle flag that bore the dying words of Captain James Lawrence, "Don't give up the ship." This flag had flown over the Lawrence throughout the battle, and Perry was determined that it would fly over an American victory. The transfer would be dangerous in the extreme. Perry would be exposed to enemy fire in a small boat, and if he were killed or wounded during the crossing, American resistance might collapse entirely. But Perry understood that desperate times called for desperate measures, and the fate of the northwestern frontier hung in the balance. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, with the Lawrence nearly silenced and his crew decimated, Perry made his fateful decision. The British guns continued to pound his flagship, but the young Commodore had seen enough. The USS Niagara, still relatively fresh and undamaged, represented his best chance to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. Prepare the ship's boat. Perry commanded his remaining officers. "I'm transferring to the Niagara." The announcement sent a ripple of both fear and determination through the surviving crew members. They understood that their commander was about to attempt something that few naval officers had ever dared, abandoning his flagship in the middle of a battle to take personal command of another vessel. Perry's aide-de-camp, Midshipman William Taylor, helped him carefully fold the battle flag bearing Lawrence's immortal words, "Don't give up the ship." This banner, riddled with holes from British shot, would accompany Perry on his dangerous journey. The flag had become a symbol of American determination, and Perry was determined that it would witness their ultimate triumph. The small boat that would carry Perry across the deadly waters was manned by 4 volunteers, his personal coxswain, Samuel Hambleton, and 3 enlisted men who had volunteered for what everyone understood might be a suicide mission. The distance to the Niagara was approximately 500 yards, but those yards would have to be covered under the direct fire of the entire British line. The Commodore's legacy extended beyond his military achievements. Perry's emphasis on treating defeated enemies with honor and respect, his concern for the welfare of his crew, and his willingness to share credit for victory with his subordinates, established him as a model of American naval leadership. The principles he demonstrated at Lake Erie would influence American naval tradition for generations. Today, Perry's victory is commemorated at Put-in Bay, Ohio, where a towering monument marks the site of his triumph. The Perry's Victory and International Peace Memorial stands as a testament to both American naval achievement and the peaceful resolution of international disputes. The battle that secured American control of Lake Erie became a defining moment in the young nation's history, proving that courage, leadership, and tactical innovation could overcome even the most formidable opponents. As Perry climbed into the boat, he took one last look at the Lawrence. His flagship was a wreck, her masts gone, her hull perforated by countless shot holes, her deck littered with the debris of battle. Yet she still flew the American flag, and her remaining guns continued to fire sporadically at the enemy. The Lawrence had done her duty, and now it was time for Perry to do his. The small boat pushed off from the Lawrence's side, just as a British cannonball crashed through the water, mere feet away, sending up a towering column of spray. Perry sat calmly in the stern, his blue uniform coat unbuttoned despite the danger, the battle flag clutched in his hands. The British gunners had spotted the boat and were now directing their fire toward this new target. According to contemporary accounts recorded in the Naval Archives, the journey across the water took approximately 15 minutes, though it must have seemed like hours to the men in the boat. British shots splashed into the water around them, and at one point a cannonball passed so close that it tore through the boat's rigging. Samuel Hambleton, Perry's coxswain, later recalled that the Commodore remained perfectly calm throughout the ordeal, even offering encouragement to the oarsmen. The sight of their commander making this dangerous crossing had a profound effect on both fleets. The American sailors, who had been wavering in their resolve, were inspired by Perry's courage. The British, recognizing the significance of the maneuver, concentrated their fire on the small boat, but their shots continued to miss their mark. As the boat approached the Niagara, Captain Jesse Duncan Elliott prepared to receive his commanding officer. Elliott, a career naval officer who had been criticized for his lack of aggressive action during the battle's opening phase, would now witness Perry's determination to personally lead the final assault. The relationship between Perry and Elliott had been strained, and this moment would test both men's commitment to American victory. Perry clambered aboard the Niagara. As British shot continued to fall around the ship, the crew of the Niagara, who had watched their Commodore's harrowing journey with a mixture of admiration and anxiety, greeted him with cheers. Perry immediately ordered the battle flag to be raised on the Niagara's mainmast, where it would fly for the remainder of the engagement. The transfer was complete, but Perry's most daring maneuver was yet to come. The Niagara was fresh, her crew was intact, and her guns were ready for action. Perry now had the opportunity to execute the decisive phase of his battle plan, but success would require splitting the British line and engaging the enemy at the close range, where American firepower would prove most effective. With the battle flag of the Lawrence now flying proudly from the Niagara's mainmast, Perry surveyed the tactical situation with fresh eyes. The British line, which had seemed so formidable an hour earlier, now showed signs of disorder. Captain Barclay's Detroit had suffered significant damage from the Lawrence's desperate resistance, and the Queen Charlotte had moved out of position to assist in the attack on Perry's former flagship. Perry's transfer to the Niagara had taken the British by surprise, and they were now faced with a fresh American vessel commanded by an officer who had already demonstrated his willingness to risk everything for victory. Captain Elliott, who had maintained a relatively passive role during the battle's opening phase, now found himself face to face with a commander whose determination was absolutely unshakable. "Captain Elliott," Perry said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had just crossed enemy fire to take command, "I want you to bring the smaller vessels into line. The Niagara will break through the British formation." Elliott nodded, understanding that Perry intended to execute the most dangerous maneuver possible in naval warfare, sailing directly through the enemy line to engage at point-blank range. The Niagara's crew, inspired by their commander's courage and the sight of the battle-torn flag now flying above them, prepared their guns with renewed enthusiasm. The ship's carronades, loaded with grape shot and round shot, were trained on the British vessels. These weapons, effective only at close range, would be devastating if Perry could bring them to bear on the enemy. Perry ordered the Niagara to come about and sail directly toward the center of the British line. This maneuver would expose the American vessel to the fire of multiple enemy ships, but it would also allow Perry to concentrate his firepower on individual British vessels. As he passed through their formation, the tactic was based on the principle that aggression and speed could overcome superior positioning. As the Niagara gathered way and headed toward the British line, Perry could see the effect his maneuver was having on both fleets. The British, who had been confident in their tactical position, were now forced to react to an unexpected threat. The American vessels, which had been fighting defensively, were now inspired by their commander's bold action. The Detroit, HMS Queen Charlotte, and the other British vessels opened fire on the approaching Niagara. But Perry's ship was moving too quickly for the enemy gunners to find their range effectively. The American vessel's approach was so unexpected and so rapid that the British formation began to lose its cohesion. Ships that had been positioned to support each other found themselves isolated as Perry's vessel drove between them. According to historical accounts preserved by the U.S. Naval Historical Foundation, Perry's decision to sail directly through the British line was considered extremely dangerous by contemporary naval standards. The maneuver required precise seamanship, perfect timing, and extraordinary courage from both officers and crew. A single mistake could result in the Niagara being trapped between enemy vessels and destroyed. As the Niagara approached the British line, Perry positioned himself on the quarterdeck where he could direct the ship's movements and encourage his crew. The battle flag, now bearing the bullet holes and battle scars from the Lawrence's engagement, streamed out in the wind as the ship gathered speed. The symbolism was not lost on the American sailors, who understood that their commander had literally carried the spirit of their earlier resistance into this new phase of the battle. The distance between the Niagara and the British line closed rapidly. Perry could now see the faces of individual British sailors as they worked their guns, trying to bring effective fire to bear on his approaching vessel. The moment of truth was approaching within minutes. Perry would either achieve a decisive victory or face complete disaster. The young Commodore's plan was about to be put to the ultimate test. Everything he had learned about naval warfare, everything he understood about leadership and courage, would be judged in the next few minutes as the Niagara sailed directly into the heart of the British formation. At 3:15 in the afternoon, the USS Niagara smashed through the British line with devastating effect. Perry's audacious maneuver had caught the enemy fleet completely off guard, and the American vessel's carronades now spoke with deadly authority. The range was so close that the muzzle flashes from the Niagara's guns nearly touched the hulls of the British vessels. The HMS Detroit, Captain Barclay's flagship, found herself caught between the Niagara and the smaller American vessels that were now pressing forward under Elliott's direction. The British formation, which had been so carefully positioned at the battle's opening, dissolved into chaos as Perry's ship sailed between the enemy vessels, delivering devastating broadsides to port and starboard. Captain Barclay, the one-armed veteran of Trafalgar, found himself in an impossible position. His flagship was taking tremendous damage from the Niagara's close-range fire, and his other vessels were being systematically engaged by the American fleet. The Detroit's crew, many of whom were inexperienced Canadian militiamen and British regulars pressed into naval service, began to waver under the intense American fire. Perry's gamble was paying off spectacularly. The Niagara's carronades, loaded with grape shot and round shot, were punching through the British vessel's wooden hulls at point-blank range. The Smashers, as the American sailors called their short-range guns, were living up to their nickname. Each broadside sent tons of metal crashing into the enemy ships, splintering wood and devastating crews. The Queen Charlotte, attempting to support the Detroit, found herself trapped between the Niagara and the reformed American line. Her captain, Daniel Pring, tried desperately to maneuver his vessel into a position where she could bring effective fire to bear on the Americans, but Perry's tactical position was now overwhelming. The British ships were fighting individually, rather than as a coordinated fleet. As the Niagara continued her devastating passage through the British line, Perry could see the effect his maneuver was having on enemy morale. British sailors, who had begun the battle with confidence in their superior position and experience, were now faced with an opponent who had demonstrated both tactical brilliance and extraordinary personal courage. The sight of Perry's battle flag, still flying despite the holes torn through it by enemy fire, became a symbol of American determination. The smaller American vessels, inspired by their Commodore's example, pressed forward with renewed vigor. The Caledonia, Ariel, Scorpion, Somers, Porcupine, Tigress, and Trip, which had been fighting defensively during the battle's opening phase, now joined the assault on the disrupted British formation. Captain Elliot, commanding this portion of the fleet, had successfully brought the vessels into effective range. The battle's tide had turned decisively. British resistance, which had been so effective during the morning hours, began to crumble. Under the sustained American assault, the Detroit's mainmast crashed to the deck. Her steering gear was shot away, and her guns were being silenced one by one. Captain Barclay, wounded by American fire, struggled to maintain command of his flagship. The Queen Charlotte, attempting to come to the Detroit's aid, collided with the British flagship in the confusion of battle. The two vessels became entangled, presenting an irresistible target for American gunners. Perry, recognizing the opportunity, ordered the Niagara to concentrate her fire on the helpless British ships. According to battlefield reports preserved in the American Battlefield Trust archives, the British fleet's collapse was remarkably swift once Perry's maneuver succeeded. The tactical advantage that had seemed so decisive at the battle's opening was completely reversed within 30 minutes of the Niagara's breakthrough. The British vessels, designed for line-of-battle tactics, were vulnerable to the close range assault that Perry had executed. The sound of battle was changing. The regular boom of coordinated broadsides was giving way to sporadic firing. As British resistance weakened, Perry could see white flags beginning to appear on enemy vessels, but he continued his assault, determined to secure complete victory. The fate of the northwestern frontier would be decided in the next few minutes, and Perry was not about to let victory slip away. As the smoke of battle began to clear over Lake Erie, the extent of Perry's victory became apparent. The British fleet, which had controlled the lake for months, was in complete disarray. The HMS Detroit, her colors struck and flying the white flag of surrender, wallowed helplessly in the water. The Queen Charlotte, entangled with the Detroit, had also surrendered, her crew overwhelmed by the devastating American fire. Captain Robert Heriot Barclay, wounded and seeing his fleet destroyed around him, made the agonizing decision to surrender. The veteran naval officer, who had lost an arm at Trafalgar and had hoped to repeat British naval success on the American lakes, now faced the humiliation of being the first British naval commander to surrender an entire squadron to the Americans. Perry, standing on the Niagara's quarterdeck, watched as white flags appeared on vessel after vessel. The Lady Prevost, Hunter, Little Belt, and Chippewa had all struck their colors. The entire British Lake Erie fleet was now in American hands, a victory so complete that it would reshape the strategic situation of the entire war. The human cost of the battle was significant. The British had lost 40 men killed and 94 wounded, while the Americans had suffered 27 killed and 96 wounded. The USS Lawrence, Perry's original flagship, was so badly damaged that she barely stayed afloat. Of her crew of 103 men, only Perry and a handful of others had escaped injury. As the British officers were brought aboard American vessels to formally surrender, Perry prepared to send his famous dispatch to General William Henry Harrison, who was waiting anxiously for news of the battle. The message, written on the back of an old envelope, would become one of the most famous communications in American naval history. "We have met the enemy, and they are ours. 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop." The surrender ceremonies were conducted with the formal courtesy typical of 18th and 19th century naval warfare. Captain Barclay, despite his wounds, personally surrendered his sword to Perry. The American Commodore, recognizing the courage that Barclay had shown throughout the engagement, immediately returned the weapon as a mark of respect for a worthy opponent. Perry's victory was complete, but the young Commodore understood the broader implications of what had been accomplished. Control of Lake Erie meant that the British could no longer supply their forces at Fort Detroit or maintain their alliance with Tecumseh's Indian Confederacy. The entire British position in the Northwest was now untenable. The captured British vessels were taken as prizes, adding significantly to the strength of the American Lake Erie fleet. The Detroit and Queen Charlotte, the two largest British vessels, would be repaired and added to the American squadron. The smaller vessels would also be pressed into American service, giving the United States complete naval supremacy on Lake Erie. As news of the victory spread, it would have profound effects on both American and British strategy. For the Americans, Perry's triumph provided a much-needed morale boost and opened the way for Harrison's invasion of Canada. For the British, the loss of their Lake Erie fleet meant the abandonment of their advanced positions and the beginning of a general retreat. The Battle of Lake Erie, according to contemporary accounts preserved in the National Archives, represented the first time in history that an entire British naval squadron had surrendered to an enemy fleet. This achievement would make Perry a national hero and provide the United States with one of its most celebrated naval victories. The young Commodore's daring transfer from the Lawrence to the Niagara, followed by his decisive breakthrough of the British line, had achieved what many considered impossible. Against a more experienced enemy fleet, commanded by veteran officers and fighting in carefully chosen positions, Perry had achieved total victory through a combination of tactical brilliance, personal courage, and inspired leadership. The immediate aftermath of Perry's victory transformed the strategic situation of the War of 1812. Within days of the battle, British forces abandoned Fort Detroit, recognizing that they could no longer maintain their position without control of Lake Erie. The American victory opened the entire Northwest Territory to invasion, and General William Henry Harrison quickly moved to capitalize on Perry's success. The British retreat from Detroit was swift and decisive. Major General Henry Proctor, commanding British forces in the region, understood that without naval support, his position was hopeless. The British Army, along with their Native American allies under Tecumseh, began a general withdrawal up the Thames River into Canada. Harrison's army, transported by Perry's victorious fleet, pursued the retreating British forces. The culmination of this campaign came at the Battle of the Thames on October 5, 1813, where Harrison's forces decisively defeated the British and their Indian allies. Tecumseh, the great Shawnee leader who had dreamed of an independent Indian nation, was killed in the battle. His death, combined with the British defeat, effectively ended organized Native American resistance in the Northwest Territory. Perry's victory had strategic implications far beyond the immediate military situation. The defeat of the British Lake Erie fleet marked the first time in history that an entire British naval squadron had surrendered to an enemy. This achievement provided an enormous boost to American morale and demonstrated that the Royal Navy, despite its global dominance, could be defeated by American courage and seamanship. The young Commodore's fame spread rapidly throughout the United States. His famous dispatch, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours," became a rallying cry for American forces. Perry was promoted to captain and received the thanks of Congress. Along with a gold medal commemorating his victory, he became one of the most celebrated heroes of the war, joining the ranks of naval legends alongside John Paul Jones and Stephen Decatur. The tactical innovations that Perry employed at Lake Erie would be studied by naval officers for generations. His decision to abandon his disabled flagship and transfer to another vessel in the middle of battle was unprecedented in naval warfare. The maneuver required not only extraordinary personal courage, but also perfect timing and flawless execution. Naval historians would later cite Perry's actions as examples of adaptive leadership under extreme pressure. The Battle of Lake Erie also demonstrated the importance of naval construction and logistics in warfare. Perry's fleet had been built in the wilderness shipyards of Presque Isle, Pennsylvania, using green timber and local resources. The victory showed that American industrial capability, even in frontier conditions, could produce vessels capable of defeating experienced European naval forces. The British prisoners taken at Lake Erie were treated with the courtesy typical of the era. Captain Barclay and his officers were eventually exchanged and returned to British service. Barclay would later face a court-martial for the loss of his squadron, but was honorably acquitted. When the court recognized that he had fought with courage and skill against overwhelming odds, Perry's victory had lasting effects on American territorial expansion and development. The security of the Northwest Territory, guaranteed by American control of Lake Erie, opened the region to settlement and development. The psychological impact of the victory, demonstrating that American forces could defeat the British on both land and sea, contributed to the growing sense of American national identity.